Good afternoon, everyone, and happy International Women's Day. Thank you so much for joining us for this, taking some time out of your day to join us. My name is Andrea Reimer, and it's a pleasure to be joining you today from the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I'm your host for the fourth and final webinar in this mini webinar series we've been running since February 15th to launch the She, They, Us Making Room in Housing campaign. You can find out a little bit more about me at the link that Ange, who is running our tech today, is going to post in the bio. And as I mentioned off the top, this is our fourth and final webinar in a four-part series. So just for review, some of you have joined us for each of them, but for those that haven't, on February 15th, we did a reality check on where we're at with housing generally, on the gender-specific crisis that women, children, and gender-diverse people face within the larger national housing crisis, and some thoughts about solutions. On Wednesday, February 22nd, we did a power hour trying to track down who ultimately has the power to make better housing decisions. The answer we came up to is all of us have that power, and the way we action that power is through using our voice. So last week, Wednesday, March 1st, we had 3 guests who are current or former decision makers talk about the impact the voices of those women and gender diverse people living with the housing crisis have had on their decisions about housing policy. You can find recordings for all 3 webinars online, and Ange is going to paste the link for that in the chat. Today, we're going to talk to some people who have been working on the ground to lift up those voices. But before we dive in, we're here today thanks to the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, a national project focused on ensuring housing policies across Canada include and prioritize women, children, and gender diverse people. Here today, as she has been the last few weeks, to tell us more is one of the founders of Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, longtime housing advocate, Janice Abbott. You can find out more about the work she's doing by checking out her bio, which will be pasted in the chat shortly. Happy IWB, Janice. Thanks for joining us again today.
Back at you. Thanks, Andrea. And I know I'm not supposed to have favorites in these webinars, and trust me, they've all been awesome, but I actually know everybody personally on this webinar today. And before I start, just a huge thanks, Andrea, Ange, Hannah, Faye, everyone kind of behind the scenes who have made these webinars happen. So that said, and while I don't know Adam as well as I know Don and Ellen, I know, Adam, you've always been there to rattle cages, to raise hell, to co-conspire. And so I want to thank you for all of the work you've done as an ally to women and gender diverse people across your I'm sure soon to be much longer career. So so thank you for that. I've known Ellen longer than probably many of you on this call are old. And Ellen has been a fierce advocate for women and for housing for all the time I've known her and longer. She's told off people that needed to be told off. One of the great things about getting a bit older is you're less afraid to say what's on your mind. And I'm going to hazard take a risk here and say Ellen is kind of at that place. She has made shit happen for as long as I've known her and for longer, and will continue to make shit happen. So hands up, Ellen, for everything you do. And Don, I've known Don for a long time as well. Don is from my grandmother's home territory, and that's how I think I got to know Don. And she's invited me into this project. We're building a little transition house in Chase, which she will tell you about. And for that, and for your friendship, Don, I will forever be grateful. So thank you too. And for those of you who don't know, the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women Housing, we're a national project. We are solely focused on influencing, improving, and prioritizing housing policy for women and children. So, and for gender diverse people. So with that, thank you, Andrea, and I look forward to hearing from everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, Janice. I'm really excited to hear the conversation today too. So you've heard a little bit about the 3 folks that are joining us today. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them, but we'd also like to hear about all of you who are joining us on the webinar today. So Ange is going to put a Menti in the chat, which just asks you a brief question about what brought you to the webinar today. So as you heard, Dawn Francois is a counselor in her community where her portfolio includes business development, administration, operations and maintenance, language and culture, and wellness. Dawn also works as the Housing Advocacy Coordinator at Atira Resource Center for Women and is a graduate in Indigenous Business Leadership, Master of Business Administration program from SFU. Ellen Woodsworth is a former colleague of mine on Vancouver City Council. She's a longtime social justice advocate and leader where she's been an organizer with the Downtown Eastside SRO Collective for 10 years. She's the co-president of WILPF Canada, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, founder and matriarch of Women Transforming Cities, and as noted, a former Vancouver City Councillor. And last, we have Adam Vaughan. He's a former Toronto City Councillor and Member of Parliament for Spadina, Fort York. Adam was one of the architects of the new national housing strategy and redesigned the federal approach to fighting homelessness. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, and happy International Women's Day. So, Ellen, I'm going to start with you. Thank you so much for joining today. Very much appreciated. You've got such an impressive record of working in community to help bring all of the experience and voices into public policy of the people that we don't often see sitting at the table in public policy, both as a community activist and advocate, and also when you were a city councillor in Vancouver. I know it's really hard to choose just one project to share when you have a very impressive list of accomplishments. And, you know, I know you would never want me to portray it as though you did them alone, right? But projects that you've been involved in. So I'd love to hear from you about a time you were particularly proud of getting a community housing need met.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you for all your advocacy and fighting nonstop and amplifying and using that intersectional lens that I treasure so dearly and learned from Kimberly Crenshaw. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm the unceded stolen lands, the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples, called Vancouver. And Vancouver is behind me, but that it's an example of what doesn't work for people. It doesn't work for me as a woman. It doesn't work for me as a lesbian. It doesn't work for me as an older person. And the most amazing group of women I was invited to join about in the early 70s when I was working as an organizer in the single room occupancy hotels in the Downtown East Side was Bridge Housing Society for Women, which the plan was to build housing for women in the Downtown East Side, which is the lowest postal income area of Canada and home for many amazing Indigenous women and girls. It's also the home of murdered and missing women and girls, both Picton Farm, and then as Gladys Reddick and Bernie Scundle drew the attention and got the murdered and missing women and girls finally recommendations activated. But Bridge Housing was held for 27 years by these women who were around the Downtown Eastside Women's Center. And for 27 years, they fought for housing, they fought for land, and finally the city found them some land, but they couldn't get any income. They couldn't get the capital or the operational costs going until finally the Working Opportunity Fund, I just ran into the right person at the right time and got that first $500,000, and then it started to move. So it was that idea of building community, strengthening community by building housing that worked for the people, the women and the Indigenous women who lived there, by working together and building the kind of housing that was both ended up being 36 units of housing and 12 transition housing right in the core of the Downtown East Side. And on the main floor and then the basement is the Downtown East Side Women's Center. So that was 27 years of women working really, really, really hard to create something that would really change lives and give a safe home. And I could
love it. So when you think back on that 27 years, can you talk a bit? I mean, you talked about running into the right person at the right time, but I'm guessing that was like one of like hundreds of actions. Can you isolate particular actions or moments that really mattered in moving that issue forward?
Many women came and went. Women died, women went missing, women were engaged with other struggles to live. I think that having a board that represented the community and the women who needed the housing was critical. finding land right in the core of where that need was, where there was transit, where there was shopping, where there was community was critical. Finding Terra housing, finding a woman architect who built housing for women. So I can think of the Vienna housing project. You know, if you build shelves that are too high, or if you don't build housing that's safe, if it doesn't have proper lighting, if the childcare isn't at the center so you can see it while you're doing the housework, all those kinds of ways that you make housing work for women, that was key to having an architect who understood those needs. And the concept of building in the women's center, so meeting multiple needs in one building, having the women's center there, having this permanent housing, having transition housing, and on the top floor, a little community area and an outdoor garden, so people aren't shut in, that they can gather together and they also can get some fresh air. So, and then really critical for us is we were thinking our board didn't have board skills. We thought, well, how many other community organizations in the downtown east side don't have board skills? So we opened up the training. April English joined us. We had amazing women come forward, and any woman in the downtown east side who wanted board training could come to those sessions. So as we got a little bit of money and a little bit of skills, we started to share those skills with other people in the community. And that's the critical thing, is to build that community as you grow. And I think in the end, it was, you know, we had many great housing project operators come forward and offer to, you know, say they wanted to run it for us. Atera was the only one who got racism. Atera was the only one who understood the situation for Indigenous women and the number of missing women. They were the only one who got the intersectional lens, that you have to have all those lenses on your work. And when we hired them, that was just a huge next step forward that was really important. And in the end, you know, all of those steps of building community as you grow is absolutely critical. So, you know, those are just a quick, I'm probably running out of time, so I'll stop, but there were many.
No. Yeah, it's great. It's really, I mean, it's so hard when you live the battle to see the pivotal moments, right? As it moves through. So I really appreciate you kind of unpacking it a bit for us. So I'd love to bring Dawn in. Dawn, thank you for joining us today. Ellen told us about a tough housing battle, but it wasn't a community. I mean, when I work outside of Vancouver, people often say to me, well, it's great you did all of that, but you're a big city, you've got a ton of resources, a relatively progressive electorate, and you're working in a really different context than us, Dawn. You're in a rural and relatively remote area in the interior of BC. Can you tell us a bit about your experience working to get housing built in your community?
Yes, white kukairap Don Francois Quest, Squalax to Saquat Muulu Takmomipla. So just in my language, which is the Swatmixchine, I just introduced myself. Hello, everyone. My name is Don Francois. I'm one of the political counselors for my community, which is Squalax. We just reclaimed our name back to our original name. So I always find that it's important that people know who I am and where I'm from. And so years ago, I used to work for Atera. I used to live in Vancouver for about 15 years, and I was one of the frontline support workers. And the building that I worked in, Janice Abbott actually worked upstairs, and she'd walk by me every day, and you know, she's like the CEO, and you're always But anyway, so you know, we started chatting, and then it turns out she's from Nisconlas community, which is just down the road from where I'm from, which like literally 10 minutes away. So we're located near Chase, which is between Salmon Arm and Kamloops, and we're located in a valley. And either direction, 45 minutes to Salmon Arm, or just under an hour to Kamloops. So we're in a pretty, I wouldn't say remote, but we're in a really rural location. So going back to how sna'a means guardian, spirit guardian in our language. And so we thought it was a really good fit for the name of our transition home. And because what we're trying to do is support and, you know, help intersectional women, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, everyone, because the valley is filled. There's the bottom floor of the valley, and then there's the mountains, right? And there's, we're between or near the big Shuswap and the little Shuswap. So there's tons of people in the back, you know, in the back part of the different valleys. So I actually wrote my capstone paper on the business plan for the safe house or the transition home. And in part of my research, I found there was probably over 15,000 people that live in, you know, the surrounding area around Chase. And there was no services, transition home, emergency, you know, shelters, anything like that, because there's a lot, like in our Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, there's a lot of poverty. So therefore there's a lack of transportation to go anywhere, because here in a city, right, which I totally forgot to acknowledge that I'm currently in Richmond, which is the Musqueam First Nations unceded territory. You know, I should have acknowledged that at the very beginning, but I'm kind of nervous, that's why I'm rambling. But anyway, yeah, so there's some social determinants of health that are alive and, you know, well in our Lakes Division, which is called the Pescaselqua. It's just like an area within our Shuswap Nation here. And so we're currently in partnership, because I've known Janice for a long time, and I worked, like, I'd like to say I worked alongside her, but but anyway, I was the former coordinator for the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing. That was last year. And so when we started talking, I was sharing with Janice, you know, what was going on, what's happening, you know, in our home communities. And so there's Adams Lake, Little Shuswap, and Nisconlith. We're called the Lakes Division. Actually, I don't even like that name, because it, you know, provides the boundaries, and like we're a shared territory. So just in my discussions with Janice, I said, there's nothing here for women, you know, or children. There's a lot of you know, murdered and missing Indigenous women. There's a lot of drug poisonings. There's a lot of women fleeing violence, but it's hard to go anywhere, because we live in poverty. And I'm not saying all of us do, but a lot of our people are still struggling, right? Just with the residential school systems and 60 Scoop and all those, you know, those horrific systems that were placed upon our people. And I think, you know, having SNUA come to life, you know, in partnership with SNUA Transition Home Society, Atira Women's Resource Society, and BC Housing, they were the three main drivers that got SNUA up and running. And I'll be forever grateful for, like, the partnership and the collaboration pieces, you know, that BC Housing and Atira, you know, recognizing, you know, a need and offering their services to help us, you know, is phenomenal. I absolutely love it. We're a grassroots group of women, you know, we're all Secwepemc women, and we're not politically attached to anyone. And, you know, it's straight from the women, you know, from our hearts to all the other women and children that will be using our services in the future. You know, it's awesome. I love it. Cook Jam, thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Such an inspiring story. I'm going to bring Adam in, but then I'm going to circle back on another question with all of us. Adam, so well, welcome. How are you doing today? Good. I think you're on mute, so I'm glad I asked you how you're doing. There we go. Obviously, I mean, just looking at the panel today, you're bringing a different perspective than the rest of us. I was going to make a joke that like clearly you're from Toronto, but that's not actually what I was going from. I was, you know, you're here on a panel with the three of us talking about housing for women, their children, and gender diverse people on International Women's Day, and you are not any of those things. But I wanted to thank you for coming into this space, because I know it continues to be an uncomfortable space for men to talk about the need for allyship with women. Not all men, obviously, because you're here. So I wanted to acknowledge and thank that. Thank you for that. So can you bring some context as a male ally working on women's housing, can you give us an example of where you've worked to bring the voices of women and or gender diverse people into housing policy in your Toronto or nationally on the national housing strategy?
Sure. Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, thank you for the invitation to share some thoughts and to learn from some folks that have been doing this work even longer than I have, but also doing it in spaces where obviously my voice is not at the table when good decisions and wise choices are made. So thank you, Dawn and Ellen, for your contributions. I'll start with a couple of things. One, I come to housing through my mom. And through the precariousness, you know, that she faced when I was growing up around housing, and it left me with an understanding that I think was encapsulated. But I'm not going to claim authorship of this, but women are the first to lose housing, the last to get housing, and the hardest to house when they need housing. And when you look at the housing system from that perspective and add gender diverse people to the equation, the more marginalized you are in economic systems, and the more power structures aim to push you away from having control over your life and control of decisions in your life, the more likely you are to end up in precarious housing. And when you lose housing, the harder it is to get back in. And so part of what we have to do as we look at housing systems and not just individual projects or individual circumstance is understand that the economics of housing is incredibly discriminatory in the way in which it's practiced in much of Canada. Not every place, and luckily lots is changing, but it's a huge hill to climb for far too many people. When I started doing some work in housing at the federal level, I had a really interesting dinner with Tantu Cardinal, the actor and artist, the Métis from Northern Alberta, who also lives in Toronto, where I'm from. And when I told her she asked me what I was up to, because she knew me from Toronto as a city councillor. I said I was working on housing, and particularly at that point, I was working on urban Indigenous housing programs for one of the ministers. And she said, you're in charge of making elders. And Tantu has a bit of a sense of humor if you've ever met her. And I sort of looked, I said, no. She said, no, it's life expectancy. You don't get elders if people don't grow old. It's part of the process. And if you're not going to grow old in our communities if you don't have good housing. And so she very quickly explained to me with humor which is hopefully an obvious truth that we all need to embrace, is that housing is as much a system of healthcare as it is of shelter. And she put me on to some folks who do work in and around the Algonquin community up in Ottawa, who talked about the Anishinaabe people, talking about housing is we live it. Our home is the world. We need shelter when we're weak, when we're tired, when we're sick, when we're old, when we're young. Shelter is where you go to be basically recharged and put back into the world to make your contributions. And if you look at it from this perspective, it becomes very easy to see why housing is a human right, in the same way that healthcare is a human right in this country. Unfortunately, housing is not held to the same funding levels or the same universality, or even the same unique sort of necessities that different people require from housing in order to succeed in it. But when you look at it from that perspective, it's very clear why you need to drive housing programs with the perspective of women in mind, because the way women use housing should drive how you actually build it, how you fund it, how you distribute it, and how you manage it. And you have lots to learn from the way households are run, especially in low-income communities, the extraordinary resources that are marshaled to create safe housing when in fact the physical structures are not safe. And I took those lessons, later in life, but if I look backward on some of the work we did in Toronto when I was a city councillor, it's easy to see how those principles played out, even though I couldn't find the words at the time to enunciate it. And the project I'll talk about that answers your correct question more directly is a neighborhood called Alexander Park. We all refer to it as Alex Park or AP a lot. And this is a low-income community that turned itself into a co-op in the middle of the start of the housing crisis in the early 90s, and was a low-income co-op that had no wealth to cooperate with. It was a low-income co-op in name, but it didn't cross-subsidize itself internally because there just wasn't any wealth in the community to do that with. Nonetheless, they had ownership and they had management control over their public housing project. And as a result, the community started to do things that no other public housing neighborhood in Toronto did. And part of that was get their kids to university. There's no other housing community in public ownership in North America that sends more of its kids to post-secondary school than Alexander Park. They have an extraordinarily high level of scholarship. And that was in large part because they turned the community center into a place to play sports, into a place to learn and to be nurtured, and most importantly, be fed. A lot of working families aren't home at dinner time, and latchkey kids skip a meal or eat late, and therefore their homework isn't done as well, and ... They realize the connection between food and housing and good outcomes in school and better outcomes economically very early on instinctively, and they drove a different kind of a social program that way. But the community center, when I became city councillor, was literally falling apart. There were cracks in the walls, had never been properly funded. The neighborhood had been neglected for a whole series of reasons. And they came to me as a group of parents, largely mothers, and said, we want to rebuild the community center. And I said, well, then we're going to have to rebuild the community. And so we reimagined a process whereby we would consolidate the housing that was currently lived in and create land, residual land, turn residual land and use that to go to market to finance the transformation of both the public housing, but also the social infrastructure in the community. And I was recently reviewing my notes for some work I was doing at the University of Toronto, and I hadn't realized at the time, but we organized the community to self-advocate for itself for 2 years before we even talked about moving a brick or a blade of grass. There was 2 years of organizing and sitting down with the community and establishing principles for redevelopment and values that we wanted to see in the new homes and goals we wanted to realize as a neighborhood before we even talked about putting a roof over our heads or moving a building or closing a parking lot or selling off land to finance a transformation of the neighborhood. And what came out of that process were some principles which I think are profoundly feminist in nature, but also drove this housing project in a way that I think created some different outcomes. For example, we sat down with all the kids in the neighborhood at a planning session and asked them to draw the neighborhood they wanted to live in. It was remarkably coherent, but it also had ideas like a toy library. It had ideas about where the food should be so they could get to it while they were playing instead of having to walk up the street and around the corner to get to the community center. Proximity and the spatial realities of the neighborhood were defined through the eyes of the young people in the community. At the same time, we walked through the houses that we were going to rebuild and effectively demolish and reconfigure in a different part of the site. So we were switching old housing for new housing, and in the process, not only upgrading the housing, but also keeping things that other public housing projects no longer have, like finished basements or laundry rooms inside the units. And we captured the value of what was working about the housing from the perspective of the people who are using the housing. A lot of single moms led this conversation and talked about the poor ventilation in the kitchen, not having windows in the kitchen that could look out into play spaces, not having gardens that were capable of growing vegetables that they could supplement their income with, either with spices or with vegetables themselves, or how they could do collective gardening, how they could contribute to food security by actually turning their yards from green grass into growing fields. And all of these ideas about how to nurture people in the housing started to emerge as design principles for the housing we were going to build in the final end. And in particular, about a third of the community are Muslim, and the way in which the kitchens were designed mattered. An open concept kitchen was not a place a woman could cook without a hijab on, but cooking and with the hijab is not the safest thing to do. And so enclosed kitchens became an option, and how we created and could retrofit houses with enclosed kitchens while also keeping the ventilation, also keeping access to windows, became part of the design principle. So we literally designed the houses from the inside out, from the heart of the house and the nurturing values of the house out to the wider community. And it drove the spatial conversations we had about design after we'd settled what was going to be inside the homes. And then I think the final and most important thing beyond sort of kitchens and gardens and calming the streets and making sure kids had places to play was that there was a very interesting conversation of what to do with men in the community. And in particular, the volatility that men can bring to a household when a whole series of other social issues and conditions come to bear. And they were also a neighborhood which was very sensitive to the criminalization of racialized Canadians in terms of the way low-income communities are policed in large cities. And they didn't want to have to call the police every time a man was having an episode, a mental health breakdown, was struggling with the intergenerational trauma around domestic violence and all those sorts of stuff. And they proposed a safe house in the neighborhood where men could go, where you didn't have to, the women didn't have to leave when there was a problem and go to outside the community to a shelter. But instead there was a place where men could go and just be calmed down and catch a good night's sleep without being traumatized by being repoliced or traumatized by being excluded from the family. But there was a community process to bring men back into harmony with the way in which the community was working. And it's a radical concept. The city is still struggling with how they can do it and why they would keep a house open in the middle of a housing crisis. But the idea here was to start using the housing differently to manage the challenges the neighborhoods were facing, but in particular the challenges that women were facing around what happened when their men or their sons or their uncles moved in a direction that wasn't coherent or safe for families to stay in those communities. And one by one, these ideas just started to emerge. And as they emerged, I would argue a neighborhood was built by women for women to house families that included a role for everyone that wanted to contribute. And I think it was it broke a lot of rules. That was the fun part. I like breaking rules, but what it really did was establish new norms for things like zero displacement. When you rebuild a neighborhood, as one young person said, you can fix the neighborhood, but don't break the community. We managed to move away forward slowly, but carefully, that treasured the connections and the social structure that women spoke to as being valuable, but allowed us to transform the other parts of the neighborhood, which clearly weren't serving the needs of the community anymore. And to me, that's part of the way you've got to rethink the way housing systems and housing models work, is you have to actually build it with the end user driving the process, as opposed to serving their needs. You have to explore what their desires and aspirations are and rebuild the housing differently to accommodate those things. And I think in that regard, Alex Park has sustained itself as a success model, even though we're only about 12 years through what was supposed to be a 16-year project.
Right. Wow, that is an amazing story. And like just the possibility it opens up in my mind about what we could be doing for women and their children and gender diverse people. John, I'm curious, like this idea of co-design, how much involvement did the grassroots women that you're working with have in the design of the transitional housing?
Yes, well, working with the architect, and our society, or it's not a society, we do side meetings, and then this is our values and our beliefs based on our societies and our governance and our language. Well, actually, our whole culture, right? We wanted it to be culturally sensitive. And so when we went back and talked to the architects, even like squares, we're not a square people. We're not a linear people. We don't go A to B like that. So when we make decisions, we include like the animals, the water, the land, of course, our culture and our language, right? So because even our boundaries, we follow the mountains and the rivers and everything. Like when you fly into, say, like Alberta, and you see all the land is completely square, we don't operate like that. So everything and how we design stuff is very fluid, very round, very, the corners on everything is like rounded off. And even when we walk in our entrance, we wanted it to be the design of our kukuli, our pit house. So when you walk in, it's, shaped like an underground pit house. So we wanted it to be very reflective of who we are and where we're from and within our Secwepemc territory.
I love it. Ellen, so we're talking a lot about what works. I would love to make a little space for what doesn't work. So just to flip it around, if there are things that you've seen that are not great strategies for approaching grassroots approaches that bring people with lived experience into advocating and building housing.
I think that I think both Dawn and Adam have got at that is that we're building housing to create a community, to create safety, to create for women a place where we work. We work in our homes doing unpaid work as well as outside the home for paid work. So I think that it's really important when we call for money for housing for all levels of government, we say that this has got to be something we're doing with the people and who are going to use this space. And this space is bigger than the individual family unit. It is community, it is generations. We have the young people. The queer young people are sleeping on the streets. Indigenous people are sleeping on the streets. Older women are now being forced out of housing. There's couch surfing by a lot of women and they're not counted in the homeless count because they're couch surfing. So we have to think of the broader community. So I think the thing not to do is to have a federal budget that spends a third of it on defense. If we took that 1/3 of the federal budget goes defense and we put into social sustainability, affordable housing, we could easily house everyone in this country and help people around the world who desperately need housing.
So Adam, I feel like that's just a great springboard for me to bring you in, although, I mean, you're not in Parliament anymore, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on defense, although you're very welcome to if you'd like. But I am curious, there is this money. I mean, so we're in this place now. When the three of us were all elected to city council in Vancouver and Toronto, respectively, we could only dream of the kind of money and housing policy that is now flowing from the federal level and here in BC from the provincial level. But it doesn't mean that money is going to support the kinds of projects that you, Adam, have just laid out, and Ellen and Dawn. So can you give us some idea, Adam, of how do you connect the voices of Dawn and the community she's working with, or the community Ellen's working with, or people watching this from all over the country with those dollars to make sure that the housing is meeting the needs of the people on the ground?
When I started doing that work in the space of urban Indigenous housing programs, one of the highest ranking Indigenous bureaucrats inside Indian Affairs, as it's still referred to technically, said he'd hidden the fact he was Mohawk all his life from his colleagues. And when he decided to retire, he came out and spoke Mohawk to them. And basically told him, I've been listening to what you've been saying about me, and I don't like any of you. He was a very funny, very clever character. But he took me aside because he had heard that I was doing work in the space, and he hadn't met me and thought I deserved a warning. And one of the things he said to me was that colonialism is nothing but a set of rules. And every time you think you're going to fix a problem with better rules, you're really just imposing neo-colonialism on a group of people that have already suffered from the previous rules. He said, if you're really interested, and the analogy he used was beautiful. He said, if you're really interested in fixing this problem, he said, it's not about, he said, rulemaking is like watering a tree. The branches just keep growing and get sort of intertwined with all the other rules and create a forest that protects itself from change. He said, if you really want to make change, prune the branches, take the rules away, and see what happens when the sun hits the floor of the forest and something new doesn't grow, because it's that new growth that's actually going to lead you to new ways of doing things. And I think that part of the problem at the federal level, and I think it's the same at the city level, is that we keep trying to make bad rules produce better results. And we wonder why we keep getting the same thing over and over again, even though we think we've changed the rules. It's because the rules keep ganging up on everybody that's been marginalized by rules. And so I think that part of the challenge, and with Alex Park is an example, but it's a practice we fell into at City Hall, is we never decided how much we were going to spend to solve a problem and then try to fit a solution into the box. We tried to figure out what the problem was by talking to people, and then figure out what the solution was by talking to people. And then it became our job as folks that had leadership positions inside governments to find the resources to finance the solution, as opposed to fund a response to the problem. And so I think part of what you have to do is grow the solutions economics as organically as you grow the project, and at the end of the day, find a way to make it work. That it's a bit of a hypothetical way of addressing a very real need, but you need to dream the right dream before you can end the nightmare in a lot of ways. And then you need to finance the solution and pour money into solutions, as opposed to pouring money into problems to get to where we need to go. And on the issue of housing, and in particular housing for those most precariously housed in the most precarious settings, I think that there are two things that need to be. The lived experience is fundamental, and listening to lived experience is more than just including it. It's actually using it to drive all of the other elements and all the other professions that come to a project. You've really got to lean into that. And then I think the second thing is that you've got to trust the solutions that people who are suffering from the affliction or the broken system. You've got to trust that their self-interest is going to drive the best solution forward. And we don't trust low-income communities easily. It is a horrible bias that many of us in government carry, is that we think that you just can't trust low-income people with dollars. The reality is it's rich people are corrupt. Poor people are too poor to be corrupt. It's the economics of housing. Nonprofit agencies don't have enough money to waste to be wasteful, and so you can trust them to use dollars effectively, to combine budgets imaginatively, to sort of evolve solutions organically out of necessity, because they do that day in and day out in their existence. Why wouldn't they be able to do it within a system of housing? And so trust people to find these solutions, and when a tough call has to be made, trust that people have to live with the decision to make the tough call, because they understand the consequences of failure much more so than anybody that thinks they're an expert is. And so it comes down to this notion of including people with lived experience as the drivers of change, not including them simply to sign off on decisions that you're going to make anyways. That to me is fundamentally the most important part of the process. And the trouble with government money is that bureaucrats are afraid of misspending every penny, and so they end up misspending every dollar instead. And that's the challenge you have when you're facing with government funding systems.
So Ellen and Don, you've both been community activists and also elected to council, and both at the same time. And as have I, actually, as I'm thinking about this. So what is your advice to people who might be listening to this, who need housing in their community, but don't know where to start? Like, how do you approach a decision maker? Because I hear in all of your stories, one of the key things was like, you know, the decision, you're the sort of plug, but you're looking for a socket somewhere, somebody who's like in government and can actually support the work you're doing. So what would you give as advice to people who might be interested in getting going on a housing project in their community?
It's who you know. No.
It helps though,
Well,
right? So it definitely helps.
I think, I don't know, like for me, it's a lot of coincidences, right? I don't know, like just knowing Janice for me was like the pivotal moment of how we connected and who we are, like our background and our history was the opening of the door, you know, that led me down a path. And just even having, you know, the education piece around, okay, what's happening with our women, you know, like how come, how did we get into this spot right now? Just knowing all, I guess like the pieces to the puzzle and trying to arrange it into a way that will, you know, help us move forward together. Yeah, and right now how we're arranged on our chief and council is, it's actually, we do portfolios, and my brother is actually the the person who takes care of our reserve housing. We're currently, we just applied for the Rapid Housing Initiative, and previous to that, we've just renovated a lot of our elders' houses that were built like in the late 70s, early 80s. So again, just knowing who to contact within ISC, you know, Indigenous Services Canada, and then, you know, because Chase is municipal, right? Just knowing those systems too with BC Housing, and, you know, with Atira's help, we managed to maneuver through the process in a good way. And then actually we went in October to bless our grounds. You know, we did a ceremony. So we all intertwine all of our milestones with our culture, our Secwepemc culture, which is actually quite awesome. And we invited the mayors out, and, you know, representatives from all the partners. So it's really good. I'm really enjoying this process. And
Awesome.
yeah,
I love that.
it's a lot of learning, because now, you know, it opens doors for, you know, we're on a different note. I'm helping, we're going to be talking with First Nations Health Authority to extend our health and wellness center, which is a totally separate project from this one. But anyway, thank you.
Separate, but as Adam said, like housing is a system of healthcare, right? Like they are like very much intertwined. Ellen, I'm sorry, I just cut you off.
No, good point. Thank you, Dawn. I think we have to build housing coalitions, and those housing coalitions have to have an intersectional lens on not all, like housing has to work for the families. It has to work for young people. We've got an aging demographic, like a tsunami. I'm part of it. I'm an elder now. And there's a federal election coming up within 2 years. We have to put housing on the agenda and saying it's outrageous. A third of the federal government goes to defense, and we have so little money for housing. Cities are running out of land. We desperately need the cities to have their own money, instead of putting money into policing, putting money into affordable housing to really address the problems.
Yeah, I'm taken by when I first went to Ottawa, somebody said, well, I guess you want to be that minister of housing. I said, no, I'll spend all my time building a ministry and no time building housing. The reality is that the way I looked at it when I first got there was that you tell me what your problem is, and I'll tell you why housing is the best tool to solve it. Whether it's, you say, Ellen, you referenced several groups that are, you know, always in a precarious space around housing, whether it's physical disabilities, or whether it's gender, or whether it's immigration status, or ... All of these are federal issues. You know, even military. We have soldiers coming off of service who are physically and mentally, you know, have been damaged by the public service they gave to all of us, and they need housing. Virtually every issue you have is made easier to solve if you start with housing as the base from which you're going to solve the challenge. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that you have to integrate the housing conversation not into a standalone issue. It is the foundation of every issue, and it is the best tool we have in the toolkit to fix virtually any problem that faces us in our community, even climate change, if you look at it, and the emissions from climate change, but reconciliation in particular. And Dawn, as you referenced the vulnerabilities within your communities in you know, in terms of how it impacts the lives of women, we wouldn't have the horrific numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women if housing was more secure. It's the space between houses where women disappear, not in safe, secure housing where they go missing. And so we need to address these issues through a housing lens right across the board, and again, do so from the perspective of the people impacted. I'll say one last thing. The other thing are these damned rules that CMHC comes up with. These arbitrary sort of, I was talking with Inuit elders in Ottawa about a housing project they wanted to build, and CMHC requires you to build units, and units are defined as having a bathroom, a kitchen, and one bedroom for every person who's going to live in the space. And they said, we don't want kitchens. In our culture, we eat communally. We have a feast table. We harvest the food together, we cook the food together, we eat the food together, and it's part of the way elders teach a child how to harvest a seal is there are songs for harvesting a seal. And that's the transfer of knowledge, it's the transfer of hunting capacity and harvesting capacity. But it's also the way in which old people get engaged with young people in our communities. And if you put us into little rooms with little kitchens, with our own tables and our own chairs, every one of us is going to lose the connection to our culture that we cherish so much over the feasting table. And they had to bend and break CMHC to fund a communal kitchen in a setting which was their money to begin with. I mean, most of the money was the Inuit Development Corporation building the project. They just needed a bit of help from CMHC to acquire the land. You've got to break those rules, and you've got to break the mindset, and you've got to, as the elder, Mr. Carter, said to me, you've got to bring a bit of sunshine to the floor of the forest to see what can grow differently if it's given a chance, as opposed to simply watering the old plant over and over and over again. And I think that's part of the lessons that we need to embrace as we embrace a different path forward, and listen to different people to pull those learnings into the present.
Okay, let's pull Ellen and then Dawn.
Well, I just wanted to, talk about the TRC recommendations and the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Two-Spirit People recommendations. Critical, housing critical. And I want to talk about domestic abuse. 50% increase of domestic abuse since COVID locked us in, and the keys aren't in women's hands. And these are three, the recommendations are there. We can look at the Women Transforming Cities work with TRC and to put housing front and center. But we've got the proposals there. But we have to make the funding available. We have to transfer the budget that's there at the federal level to those recommendations and to address domestic violence.
Nice. Dawn, you want to jump in?
Sure. I just wanted to add, I think all of us, we all have, like in our area, our Secwepemc ways, we have the answers. We know the answers. We don't need external people, consultants, or whoever coming in and telling us, this old patriarchal oppressive point of view, right? We know what we need to do, and based on our cultural ways, right? And I love Adam's answer about the communal kitchens. It's, they're so formula based. We also had that issue too. No, we don't cook separately. And they wanted to put the kids over in a separate room. And we're like, no, we don't do that. We don't separate the parents and the grandparents from the children. Everyone just mishmashes together, because that's how you do that transfer of knowledge, right? So like trying to, understand who we are and where we're from. Like there's still a lot of growing and learning that needs to happen. However, it goes at a really slow pace because it's over there. Whoever back east makes decisions, right, for over here on the West Coast. And even at that, we're all of our cultures are similar, but we're not the same people, Again, we all have our own answers. And if they bothered to ask us, we would share. And right now we're starting to yell, the squeaky wheel gets the, the crumbs, I guess. So anyways, small progress is better than no progress. That's all
I mean, my perspective, Dawn, Adam, Ellen, the stories that you shared today are huge progress, right? But I hear you, there's still a whole mountain range left to climb. I'm very conscious of time, Dawn, because I know you have to go in a minute. So I did want to say before we have to jump off that this is the last of 4 webinars, but we're actually just getting started on the Making Room in Housing campaign. So this weekend, we're launching a 4-part training series that's for women and gender diverse people to help build advocacy capacity, access to organizing tools, learning about power, and Olivia Chow's joining us to help folks build their public narrative. That'll be happening over the next month. We have training for housing providers that'll be happening later in April about how to do exactly everything we just talked about, which is how to connect the voices of community and people with lived experience to the service that they're providing. And we've got a podcast series coming up This is all in service of supporting people to raise their voice about everything we've talked about today, about the need to hear from women, their children, and gender diverse people about their needs in housing. So Ange has just put our call to action in the chat. Our tool went live today to help folks, and I would invite the three of you to be some of our very first people to use the tool. It allows you to write to the federal government and advocate for exactly the kinds of things we've just been talking about. There's the calls to action from the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, but also lots of room for you to add your own. Ellen, Adam, Dawn, thank you so much, not just for today, but for all your legacy of work and ongoing work to make room for women and gender diverse people in housing. And to everyone who's joined us this last 4 weeks, thank you so much for your time. And please consider this the beginning of our work together to raise up the voices of women and gender diverse people in order to make room for them in housing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Gotcha.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Dawn.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
See you again. Bye,
Bye.
Andrea.